When we go out to eat, we never agree on where to go.
I want burgers.
Pizza.
Tacos it is.
The one thing we do agree on is we all want unlimited high-speed data. That's why we switched to Metro PCS.
Stop by Metro PCS with the whole family and get 4 lines with unlimited LTE data for just $100, period. Metro PCS. Wireless. Figure it out.
Coverage not available in some areas. Offers require port and of number not currently active on T-Mobile network. During congestion, the fraction of customers using more than 35 gigs per month may notice reduced speeds. Video streams at up to 40p. No tethering. See store for details and terms and conditions.
Welcome to the Race Haven Radio Show and Podcast, your source for solutions-focused dialogue about race in America, with your host, Scott Speed.
Hello, and welcome to the Race Haven Radio Show and Podcast. My name is Scott Speed, and I am the facilitator of the dialogue. This is episode 11 of Race Haven, and the title of today's show is Trauma. And our special guest today is Grammy Award-winning artist and lead MC and vocalist of the group Arrested Development, Speech Thomas. Speech and Arrested Development won 2 Grammy Awards in 1993 for Best New Artist and Best Rap Performance by a Duo or Group, and were also named Band of the Year by Rolling Stone magazine. They've toured the world and produced several albums from the early 90s to the present day, with their latest release this year titled This Was Never Home, which features the song Trauma, which inspired this episode. So let's bring on our guest today. Speech, are you with us?
Yes, I am. How you doing, Scott?
I am doing great. I want to thank you so much for making time in your busy schedule to come on the Race Haven podcast today. How's your day going so far?
It's going really good. It's been awesome.
Awesome. Speech, you sound a little bit at a distance. If there's anything you can do to kind of adjust your volume, that would be great. And while you do that, I just want to tell our listeners how we met before we jump into the dialogue. Just so our listeners know, I like to share before each episode how I met our guest. So Speech and his wife, Yolanda, they opened up a performing arts school in Fayetteville, Georgia, called the Victory Spot. And my daughter, she just loves the performing arts and dance and music and acting. And when we heard about it, we have been thinking about, what we could do to get her involved in those things. And when we heard about the Victory Spot, we were so excited. And through that, relationship, we've been able to get to know both Speech and his wonderful wife, Yolanda, much better and developing a relationship. And it's been an honor to get to know them as someone who, I grew up listening to. So it was really cool to meet them in person and get to know them. And now to have an opportunity to dialogue, with Speech about a topic that I'm passionate about and one that I know he's passionate about as well, which is race in America. Again, welcome to the show, Speech.
Thank you. And I just want to congratulate you on the show. I'm proud of you, brother. I know that we've had some talks in the lobby of the Victory Spot, and just knowing your passion for children, for the people, for the world, and just for things to heal is just encouraging. And good talks. Very proud of this show. Happy to be on it, man.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. And I want to jump into, the song Trauma, which you put out recently for your new album. And, it came across, you actually posted it into our Race Haven Facebook group. And when I saw it, I was just totally, it just resonated with me because I thought that it spoke, it spoke to, the voice of what African Americans are trying to help other Americans understand about the struggle. I guess that's the best way to say it. And all too often, as I get involved in these conversations about race through this platform, Race Haven, and then seeing other race-based, discussions through the media and social media, is really frustrating because it's, you're trying to get a message across and it's falling on deaf ears a lot of time. or at least it feels that way. There are people who get it that aren't African American, but we continue to push because we see that enough people aren't getting it, and we're still seeing some of the same problems, not just outside the African American community because of a lack of understanding of the trauma, but also within the African American community. There's trauma that we're not addressing, and this is Scott speaking from my perspective. We're not addressing, and therefore we continue to see some problems. So what I thought would be cool for today's show is to break down the lyrics of the song Trauma. And what we're going to do, because this is a show about dialogue, Speech and I are going to dialogue about his lyrics. And I'm going to give my perspective on what I took away, from this piece of art. And then Speech is going to give his perspective based on, what motivated him, to write these specific lyrics. But before we get into that, Speech, if you can just give our listeners an idea of just why you wrote the song before we jump into the lyrics, that would be great.
No, I appreciate it, brother. Well, this song is, songs sort of come from a very special place. And all my life, all my adult life, I've thought about the fact that, a lot of the realities that we face as a people, and even some of the difficulties, our first single, Tennessee, I said, why does it have to be so darn tough? And I said, brothers and sisters keep messing up. Why does it have to be so darn tough? And it was just talking about some of the perspectives that even black people hold about ourselves. It talks about some of the pathologies and the problems that we face as a people, and some of them against each other. And the song Trauma was really my attempt to write a song about all of the things that have happened to us and some of the pathologies that come from that. So going back, to our detour as an African people and the whole detour of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, all of the, it's so amazing how much has happened to us since then and during that entire experience that is not often talked about in our culture. And I wanted to try, and it's just an attempt, but to try to write a song about the trauma, because it's rare that people in pop culture or in mainstream culture talk about that. You know what I mean? They don't talk about the trauma that happens from anyone who's went through horrific things, and in particular blacks. And so that was my attempt. It was an attempt to try to put it in a capsule, in a 3.5 minute, 4 minute capsule. And it's tough. It's tough to do, but I tried to do it,
Well, I think you did a great job. And, as I did my research and trying to understand and bring some context, I wanted to look up the definition of trauma. And it was simply, the first definition that I came across is simply a deeply distressing and disturbing experience. And that's the definition of trauma. So as the backdrop of starting out with that definition, I want to jump into the lyrics. And I'm excited about the ground that we're about to cover. Because I believe it's going to provide a lot of insight and context for our listeners. Because one of the things that I wrote.
This is cool, by the way. This is cool, by the way, because I've never actually, on radio talked about my lyrics in this way. So it's pretty cool. I appreciate you even doing this.
Oh, man, I'm excited. I appreciate it. And I appreciate your willingness to do it. So with that being said, one of the things that I said on Facebook when I reposted this video is that, again, through my dealings with non-African American people about these issues, a lot of times, people have a hard time grasping, why these. A lot of times when people will say, well, that it's a victim's mentality to continue to hold on to the past, or they'll say, it's an excuse, it's a crutch, it's an excuse to continue to bring up the past and talk about trauma, because we have this concept of something called the American dream. And within this American dream concept, you're not supposed to admit that you have pains, flaws, trauma, and the psychology that goes into what it means to be human doesn't exist in this world of American dreams. So one of the things that I was so fascinated about, and one of the things that I wanted people to see on Facebook and our listeners on this show, is here we have someone who has, for the last 20 plus years, has been someone who's been living a lifestyle that most people would say is the American dream. However, you've been able to articulate this trauma because you are an African American, an American of African descent whose ancestors were, slaves. So you still understand this trauma. So it has nothing to do with monetary success or, career success. This is still something that's internal. It's in our psychology, and I want people to really grasp that. So with that being said, I want to just jump to the first set of bars, and I hope I'm saying the lingo right. But, it says this. It says, always stopped by the police, treated like a foreign enemy, invisible barriers, segregated areas, deep-seated anger, spoon-fed hatred, walking time bombs up in my slums, no respect is given, so dudes is taking some. So if I can first just tell you what that means to me, and then I would love for you to share, what your intent was. So just from the first one, always stop by the police, treated like a foreign enemy. There's so many statistics out there that prove that African Americans, are, disproportionately stopped by the police and all these different things in our urban communities. And I'll say for me as an African American, it's sad, but it actually sucks that when I see those lights behind me, there's something that shakes up inside of me. And there's a little bit of fear there, even though I'll say mostly for me, most of my encounters with law enforcement have been positive. However, there's still that fear because I've heard the stories. I know people personally who've been mistreated and beaten for the wrong reasons by police officers and they were innocent in different stories in addition to the ones we hear in the mainstream media. So I always have that level of fear that I hope it's not the day that I'm, mistreated. So that fear, that stress is something that I carry as an African American. And like what you said, treat like a foreign enemy. And it's almost like we're not home. And I know that speaks to the title of your album, but it's almost like we're not even home. We're not, it's not, America has not embraced us yet. We don't feel as comfortable. And then when you spoke to the deep-seated anger and spoon-fed hatred, walking time bombs up in my slums, no respect is given, so dudes is taking some. Now, this is really complex, and I know a lot of people aren't going to buy this, but when I think about the young people that are what I consider the walking time bombs, there's a saying that, hurt people hurt people. Through my work in urban communities, through my nonprofit, as a teacher, and just as someone who grew up in inner city West Philly, I know this element well. So when I see young men who pick up guns and choose to use that as a form of power, where some people see thugs, I see hurt people. I see people that weren't nurtured and who feel like they're throwaways. I did some master's study in social work, and I worked in group homes as a internship. These are literally kids who literally are thrown away by the system. And some of them, where a lot of people expect for everyone to pick themselves up and go towards success, I don't think people understand that there's an element of people who were literally thrown away. They lived their entire youth with no love. They were raised by the state. And in most instances, these are the kids who go back into the communities that are causing havoc. And they're using that gun and criminality and actually using the force of murder to take the respect that they feel like they've never been given. So I'm not so quick to demonize them because my mindset is I'm always thinking about the root. So I'm thinking, how can we, help that demographic and give them the love that they need so they're not there taking the respect that I feel like that's what I read from those lyrics. It took me to that place. So I'll let you, elaborate on what your intent was behind those lyrics.
First of all, I appreciate that. Great analyzation of the lyrics. And I think you're right on point with everything that you shared. And, you really can't be wrong with how you interpret a song. I'm going to share, obviously, what I was thinking, and it's pretty deep. But I wanted to go back just for a second and share what you were saying as far as the American dream and what many people will say about that and say, you know, don't look in your past. It's not about that. It's about your future. It's about moving forward. It's not about being a victim. And I just want to say something to that point. No one says that argument except for black people and except for our situation. So in other words, when 9/11 happens, everyone in America understands the need to talk about the trauma of the situation, the need to always remember that situation. Everyone talks about the reality of veterans who come home from war and they are scarred and they are torn, and it is hard for them to emotionally connect. It is hard for them to get back into society and be productive in many instances. It's hard for them to relate to regular citizen-oriented things. These things are clearly understood in all circumstances except when it comes to black people. And so I just want to say that no one really actually says that in all the other areas. They just really say that when it comes to our struggle. And then you have to ask the question, well, why? Why is it unique when it comes to our struggle? And I just want to say that my experience on answering that question is that our struggle brings up discomforting, uncomfortable realities of this country that this country would rather forget. It doesn't exactly match, and it never has exactly matched the brand of this country, if I can use the term brand. The brand of this country is the free and the home of the brave and so on and so forth. And yet when you look at these situations, you see cowardice, you see hypocrisy, you see flat out, evil to the amount of Hitler and some of the huge people that people talk about when they think of world evils and atrocities that have happened. You see that here in this country, and we would rather forget it. And I say we, meaning the majority of this country, especially non-blacks, would rather forget it. And so another thing that people tend to forget about these atrocities that have happened, is they're more numerous than one can easily rattle off. So, for instance, 9/11 happened on September 11th, and that's one huge incident, and we can mention Pearl Harbor that happened, and we look at it rightfully so as terrorism. But there is some terroristic acts that have happened here in this country's soil from whites, unfortunately, many whites, against blacks. And those incidents are far too many to mention, even in this interview. But if you go and start to research it, you'll only go deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole to find out that there's so many. And people don't want to recognize that. And I say people meaning the majority doesn't want to recognize that. And even a lot of blacks who just simply would rather be complacent than deal with the pains that are right in front of them. Many of us would rather be in denial, would rather shop the pain away, party the pain away, or drug the pain away instead of having to deal with this pain. And the thing about pain, and I'm sorry, I know I'm not trying to procrastinate, I just want to hit this issue. The thing about pain is that you have to deal with it head on. These things people know. This is pretty popular theory when it comes to pain. But when it comes to ours, again, there's this skirting away from dealing with it. But you have to deal with pain head on, because if you don't, it just collects. It's like sweeping it under the rug. And after a while, if you sweep anything under a rug, it starts to become a pile, and that rug is you're unable to walk on that rug. And that's where we've gotten in this country. And so that's why songs like Trauma and even this discussion we're having is so important. It's not just a situation of making sure people understand history or spreading consciousness. It is a situation of let's get to some healing, because I have a feeling that even the reason white people say, or a lot of white people, not all of them, that many white people say things like, you need to get over it, is because they don't want to deal with the pain of this. I think that they do feel the pain of it as well. The good-hearted folks that I've met that are white, they hate that racism exists. But what they don't want to do, generally, is deal with it and have to face it.
Right.
And so I think that's where, songs like Trauma, and that's why the whole reality of the trauma that black people face needs to be dealt with, because it is a American issue. It's not just a black issue. This is an American issue. This is really hitting at the soul of America.
I agree.
And healing the soul of America so that America can truly become what she was supposed to be. So anyway, to the lyrics, always stopped by the police, treated like a foreign enemy. We have attempted throughout the almost 400 years of our time here to assimilate into the American culture in every way possible, whether it meant giving up our African culture, which we were forced to do when we came here as slaves and became slaves, but also joining the army, even fighting for a country that at the time we had no rights within. We have shown so many examples of us striving to make this home. We, as the elders say, make lemonade out of lemons. We were handed, to say it lightly, lemons, and we have, and I applaud us, we have done everything that we could possibly do, from patience to assimilation to forgiveness beyond belief. I honestly think we have probably shown the most forgiveness of any people that I personally know of throughout the planet. It's just been astounding, our level of grace, forgiveness of the pains that we face. And so yet we're still treated like a foreign enemy. And it hurts. It hurts even people that haven't been treated that way personally, as you were talking about. It hurts because you know that you're part of a tribe. Everybody in this world is part of a tribe. We're part of a people that we feel related to. And it might be because of our skin color. It might be because of how we were raised. It might be because of our morals, our values. But we're all part of a tribe. And as a black person, especially as a minority, you definitely feel a sense of tribalness with other black people in this country. We're a minority. It's rare that we'll be in a room with a lot of us around unless we're in a black community. We're very used to looking at one another as brothers and sisters. So even if I haven't faced the constant trauma by police or the constant harassment or the stop and frisk, because it's based on skin color, I relate to it as if it's my own. It's just like if your mother or your brother face something consistently, whether it's an illness or a problem, you feel it in a personal way because you're close. That's part of your tribe. That's part of your people. And so that's why all black people are able to feel this trauma, even if they themselves, or I should say most black people, are able to feel this trauma, even if themselves haven't faced it in a specific way. You still realize that it's because of skin color, that's part of my tribe, that's part of my people, and it hurts. And then when you see it being done over and over again and no consequences are faced by the perpetrators, then that's a double hurt. So there's one hurt when it happens in the first place. But then there's another hurt when there's no prosecutions and people are let off for absolutely free. Well, then that's where this lyric of treat it like a foreign enemy comes to play. It's one thing to be stopped by law enforcement. People do things wrong. People make mistakes as police. But it's another that when a wrongdoing has happened and no one is prosecuted, there's no consequence to their behavior. And then it says invisible barriers and segregated areas. And these are things that, as black people, obviously, we've learned to see. We've learned to recognize it. And you're right. I mean, I'm a rich man compared to most in the world. And to be honest, most Americans are. But I'm even above most Americans as far as how much I make on a yearly basis. And yet, I still feel these invisible barriers. There's things that you start to realize, wow, there's no one like me in this particular area or this room or in this position or this position of power or influence. There's no one like me here. Or there's so very few that there seems to be a problem here. And then it becomes the segregated areas, and you realize as you travel throughout this world, as I do as a musician, and even just as an average citizen, you travel throughout the world and you start to see these invisible barriers. And it's talked about in a lot of songs. Tracy Chapman talked about on the other side of the tracks. And a lot of people have used that term, on the other side of the train tracks. Or in my neighborhoods, people say on the other side of Martin Luther King Drive. It's like all of the invisible realities that you see that separate one neighborhood from the next. You could be in a nice, primarily white neighborhood, and the streets are clean. And I'm talking about city services now. I'm not talking about what the people do. City services, the streets are clean. The plants in the landscaping is incredible and impeccable. And then you go a few blocks over into a black community, and the streets are absolutely messy. And you could tell there's been no service. In a city capacity, I'm not talking about what the people do or don't do, but the city has not been concerned about keeping up, even the city portion of things.
Wow.
You realize that there is definitely invisible barriers. You realize that there is a definite difference between one area and the next. And then lastly, it says deep-seated anger, spoon-fed hatred. And again, I know we probably won't have enough time to go into all of this, but I just want to say deep-seated anger is more than just what has happened to us in this day and age and what happens to any individual black person. But when you start to see the trend and you start to realize that historically this narrative has been played out for hundreds, not just a couple years or 1 year or 2 years, but hundreds of years, and you start to really get angry about the reality that has been unfortunately put upon or placed upon our people for no fault of our own. And even when we've shown intense grace and intense love and compassion and strived to be a team player in a sense. Spoon-fed hatred. All you have to do is look into the history books and recognize how much unfortunate offensive things that have been done against us through marketing, through the laws, and of course through the powers that be, whether it be the police, the government. I was just watching Unforgivable Blackness, the story of Jack Johnson just recently. And when Jack Johnson won a boxing match, it was a black brother against a white brother. And he won a boxing match. And in the Los Angeles Times, one of the most influential newspapers of our country, covered that match the next morning. They said, "Don't hold your heads up high, black people." And I'm paraphrasing. They said, "You are still in a position of inferiority." This is the major newspaper in our country.
Wow.
Speaking about us, telling us not to be proud, telling us not to be joyful, telling us that we are inferior, telling us that we will always stay in a position of inferiority. This is our country's history, and it's not to bring it up just to bring up hard things and hard facts. It's to understand why people feel like there has been spoon-fed hatred, literally feeding us hatred of ourselves. And that's just one example. And I know the whole doll experiment that was done with black kids wanting to pick whether to pick a white doll or a black doll.
Yep.
These things have been scientifically proven, and we've been talking about them for many years. This spoon-fed hatred is very real. And so the next part of it, when it says walking time bombs up in my slums, this is a lot of where this is coming from. It's not just that people are poor or they don't have after-school programs or some of the things that people mention as solutions, which I think are great things that can contribute to solutions. But it's not even just that. People are walking time bombs because they realize, like you had just said a minute ago, that they feel discarded. And they have rights to feel that way. There is actually legitimate reason to feel that way. And so they are walking time bombs. They feel literally that there is no love out there for them. And it says no respect is given, so dude's taking some. And, I was watching and this is going to be my last piece. I'm sorry I'm so long-winded, but it's a deep topic, and I don't know another way to go at it with short sound bites.
Oh, no, we're good. That's the benefit of a podcast. Keep going.
I appreciate you. Thank you. No respect is so dudes is taking some. I was watching a documentary on the Crips and the Bloods, and ironically, and that's one of the most horrific and destructive two gangs that exist in this country, and has totally wiped out many unnecessary, caused unnecessary deaths of many blacks and Latino people. But it's how those organizations started initially was to protect the neighborhood from the police. And these organizations were initially a club that formed in order to combat the physical violence that they were getting consistently from police. And so they figured the strongest among us are going to band together, and we're going to use physical violence to make sure that we don't get beat down. We're going to protect ourselves. And, of course, over the years and over some very horrible manipulation, they became a demon within the community as far as I'm concerned, which is killing one another and so on and so forth. But the point is, no respect is given, so dudes is taking some respect. And that's what I meant by that line. So I'll stop there because I don't think you went any further. But
no, I appreciate that detailed analysis. And so I want to ask you a question because, everything you just explained, I hear the rebuttal from some of my European American group members who chime in on some of these debates and dialogue discussions that we have on our Race Haven group, as well as through other threads about race. They'll say, but when you mention all these things that you just mentioned in terms of some of the things that the spoon-fed hatred and the reasons why there's deep-seated anger, and you mentioned being mistreated by the police and things like that a lot of African Americans, unfortunately, especially poor African Americans, have to experience. But then you'll have people who will say, but speech, what about, and I hate even saying it because I don't believe in this term, but black on black crime, black on black murder, or, what about, people making bad choices? What does that have to do with anything you just said? And it's like you're not. What about self accountability? This is America. Everyone has a choice in the things they do, and slavery and segregation, etc., has been over, since the 60s. So what's the excuse for the people today who continue to ravage their communities and etc.?
Sure.
What would be your response to that?
I think that it's a deflection of the initial point. So it's not that it's irrelevant. It's just a deflection. It's a whole other issue. And so let me explain what I mean by that. First of all, no one says those same arguments with other situations. It's similar to what I said earlier about the whole American dream thing. There was a young white girl who was robbed from her house, kidnapped from her house, and was taken captive by her captor. And this was in the news about, 5 or 6 years ago. And it was horrible. And I don't know exactly what happened to her. She may have been raped. She definitely was victimized in numerous ways. And when they finally found that young girl, they realized that she had been under serious distress, serious trauma, and rightfully so. They gave her unlimited time to work out her life. They realized that this young girl needed therapy. There was another situation in Ohio similarly where 3 girls, or maybe it was 4, were held captive against their will by some guys in the house, and they were found. And just like this scenario of the young white girl I was just mentioning, rightfully so, they were said, man, we need to give them time, unlimited amounts of time. They need tons of therapy. They may never be the same. This has totally redirected their life. Now, these are just events that happened. In one case with the 3 women, I think they were locked and stolen for like 15 years or something. And the other young girl, I think she was taken for like a year or so. And now let's multiply that by not 10 years or a decade, not 100 years, which is a century, but let's now talk about 3 to 4 centuries of this type of trauma. And that's why I say that it's a deflection when someone says, well, what about black on black crime? What about this, that, and the other? What about that, this, and the third? It's a deflection from the realities of the trauma that has happened to this individual or to these individuals or to us as a people in this case. That's why it's a deflection. And no one uses that same argument with these young girls. No one says, well, they were snatched away, but she also was doing drugs. Or she was snatched away, but she also was a D student. No one says that, and rightfully so, because it doesn't matter with what just happened in the situation.
Right.
And so when we talk about trauma, it is not appropriate to bring up black on black crime. Now, it doesn't mean black on black crime is not a discussion that should be had. But if we have that discussion, it totally needs to be separate from the trauma that black people face and have faced in this country.
I'm glad you stated it that way, because, you know, I often have discussions, and I had one recently with someone who was saying that the Black Lives Matter movement is stupid. And this is an African-American person who said the Black Lives Matter movement is stupid because it doesn't address, you know, crime within African-American communities. And my point was exactly what your point just was. And it's what I say to people all the time. That's two separate issues. And it really bothers me that people try to lump them together and want to deflect the purpose of what Black Lives Matter is all about. They have a valid purpose, which is, you know, raising awareness about the misuse of force. And I'm not quoting their mission. You know, I'm just giving my perspective of what their mission is. You know, but they protest the misuse of force by the state and the lack of accountability against this, you know, from the state when this misuse of force happens, states violence, you know, when police abuse or murder citizens. That's their focus. So it bothers me, not in an emotional state, but it's something I just don't understand, and it's something I wish that people would understand the difference. And and I find it interesting that people fall into this trap of, like you said, a deflection from the real issue of saying, well, why is there a Black Lives Matter movement when they're not focusing on the crime and the murder that happens within underprivileged African-American communities? And what my saying to them is two different issues, both very important. Which one do you want to talk about? You know, so yeah, it's just two different things. So I appreciate you know, sharing that, and hopefully, you know, that will inform some of our listeners. So to move along here, I'm going to jump through some lyrics here and highlight another portion of the lyrics and kind of give my insights and then get yours. And you state in these lyrics that you say that the middle passage millions transition, those that arrive wish they had died swimming. To survive, Africans killed the pride within them. Now they want to ask us, where is our pride? Trauma. That was so powerful to me because, again, it's just amazing how you capture it. And like you said, and I understand that it's harder to capture such depth in such little time. So, I mean, again, you did such a magnificent job of doing that.
Thank you, brother.
Oh, no doubt. So with the middle passage, you know, what you're referring to for people who don't know, this is what the transatlantic slave trade, the voyage from Africa to the Americas, was called the Middle Passage. And millions of Africans died, you know, during this Middle Passage. And they died from disease. They died from, you know, mental trauma and going crazy just because of the conditions that they were in. And they died sometimes because they were killed, you know, by the workers, the Europeans workers. So yes, for so many reasons. And they were thrown over into the sea. Literally millions were thrown over into the sea. And what you capture here is that there's some who actually survived that traumatic voyage, which took months to get to the U.S. or South America or wherever, and they wished that they had died swimming. They wished that they didn't make it. And to survive. And then with that being said, what you wrote when you said to survive, Africans killed the pride within them. What I want our listeners to capture, and many probably already have, but what I'm getting from this, which I found very powerful, is that to be able to have your humanity stripped from you in the ways that they were stripped through the slave trade in America, to have your family, to give birth to a child and have that child sold away, to have a relationship with a woman, but knowing that the master, the European master, could come in and have his way with her and you could do nothing about it. And if you did speak up, you would get beaten or killed. It just kills you as a person. It literally kills your insides. You are no longer human. And then the only way you can survive these traumatic experiences is to totally like just eliminate pride. You cannot even fathom and place yourself in this world as a human being. You have to, like as a defense mechanism, you have to kill the pride within you, because if you don't, it will drive you mad. So now, because of something called transgenerational trauma, they want to ask, where is our pride? And when you say they, for me, that not only, we're not just speaking of European Americans or Mexican Americans or anyone that's non-African. We're also talking about African Americans who have a hard time understanding the implications of this transgenerational trauma. Okay? And they want to say, well, where is the pride? And they don't understand why so many people who are descendants of slaves struggle with having pride, struggle with accepting their humanity. And it's a combination of the things we mentioned previously and the generations of being beaten down and the mentality of that, but also as a coping mechanism. I don't think people understand that African parents actually like beat the pride out of their kids, because in order for their kid to survive, they didn't want them having unrealistic expectations on what they could be and what they could accomplish. So now that gets passed down from generation to generation. And unfortunately, now let me say this, fortunately for some of us, there were people like my grandfather who broke that cycle. Because I have this concept in my mind that as African Americans, there's cycle breakers and there's legacy builders. For me, I consider myself a legacy builder because my grandfather, he broke that cycle and he instilled that pride in us, and he achieved in his life. So I was able to look to him as the beacon of success and pride. Unfortunately, there's other African Americans, descendants of slaves, who haven't had anyone come along in their generation, in their lineage, to break that cycle. And some of us are born with this innate ability to have that pride and that go for it and that ambition to do it. And others are still suffering because they don't have it within them, because we're not all the same. You know, we don't have all have the same mental makeup, and they haven't broken that yet. So that's why we see that, and I sympathize with that. And I say all that to say that it bothers me when people say, Speed, you know, you're making excuses for people. It's because I understand psychology. I understand trauma. I understand post-traumatic stress. I understand transgenerational trauma, that I feel for those people and I empathize with them rather than demonize them. So that's kind of what I took away from that. So I'll let you elaborate on that if you'd like as well.
Honestly, Scott, you hit it on the nose. It's perfect what you just shared, because that is what I felt. And let me also say, just for the listener's sake, that, you know, the reason I mentioned the middle passage, I wanted to separate, because I do hear from a lot of my white brothers and sisters who don't understand all of this whole dialogue. They say, well, slavery's been around since the beginning of time, which is a true statement. But it's important not to mix up the transatlantic slave trade with slavery of the past. It was a very unique slave experience that never had been at least recorded in the history of the world, and never has happened since. And so we know that there is sex slaves today. There is all types of horrible and horrific realities of slavery even today. It's very different than the transatlantic slave trade. And prior to the transatlantic slave trade, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, and in other places in the world, there was slavery that was very similar to indentured servitude. Many times people would work for someone because they were captured in warfare or various ways, and they would work for sometimes 7 years. Sometimes they would be able to move up the ranks to even become masters, to become owners of various things. This was very different. So the transatlantic slave trade and the slavery that we're speaking of that happened throughout the Americas, the Caribbean, and so on and so forth, Europe, that was a very different slavery. And so when I talk about middle passage and millions transition and those that arrived wish they had died swimming, and to survive Africans killed the pride with him. So, yeah, all of those things. I just wanted to add that. Everything else you just said, though, hit it on the nail. It's really what I was striving to express.
Awesome. And I forgot one last verse where you said, how can I describe what it feels like to be dead alive? And I think that's kind of what I was speaking to, and you said it and you hit it. And that's what you're trying to describe, and that's what we're trying to get, our listeners and people who, are still learning, because I feel like this is the re-education. I call this show and the work I do on Facebook as a social activist, social media activist, the re-education of America to be continued, because most people, their history stopped at high school and it didn't cover these things. So we have a tremendous opportunity through a platform like this and through your art to continue to re-educate America on, how these things feel. And we have a voice like we didn't have before.
Scott, can I say something too on that Dead Alive piece?
Mm-hmm.
I think that this is this conversation, and especially for many of our European and brothers and non-African brothers and sisters out there, this conversation is really an exercise in helping them to truly understand our humanity as Black people. Because whether they know it or not, subconsciously they've been taught that our humanity is less than the humanity of other people. They may not agree with that because, again, they've been taught that it doesn't exist, so it's subconscious that they feel this. But I want to just express that one example of what I'm speaking about is recently heroin has become a huge issue within the white communities in rural and different parts of America. And if you notice the conversation about heroin abuse, when it comes to our white brothers and sisters, is that of they are victims. It is not a criminal situation. This is an addiction, and they are victims of this reality. And yet, when crack was at its biggest in the early 80s, and for quite a while, and was ravishing communities within the Black community, it was looked at as criminal. And the whole way of addressing it was in a criminal way and was, let's get harder and harder on people, as opposed to they are victims. They are victims of addiction and so on and so forth. I say that because that is the difference between looking at someone with human eyes and looking at their humanity and realizing that everyone has weaknesses, everyone has flaws. And even in this particular race right now for the presidency, one of the issues talked about is this new phenomenon of many white brothers and sisters struggling with heroin. And again, looking at it as victims, looking at them as victims. And no one is using the argument they're not victims. Stop looking at yourself as a victim. Get over it. Why don't you pull yourself? No one's saying these same arguments that are used against us. And so I say that just to show the hypocrisy and the double standard as people want to try to understand what we're talking about. And now these people are addicted to heroin, and we see them as human, rightfully so. We see them as needing help. And yet here's victims of hundreds, and I keep going back to this because if you look at it as just a small window of time, like the last few years, it doesn't give just due. But now we're looking at hundreds of years of this same type of abuse, this same type of emotional distress, and people say that you just got to pull yourself up. It's not a fair, to compare the two is not even fair, but to suggest that we should, as Black people as a whole, easily pull ourselves out of this situation and not have that same compassion that you're willing to give to a relatively new phenomenon of heroin abuse within the white community is the reason why things like Black Lives Matter has to exist. I said it in my TED Talk that I did. I talked about the reason Black Lives Matter is there is because all lives matter isn't what it needs to be just yet, and that's why Black Lives Matter has to be there. It's to help get all lives matter to become a real reality. And so I just wanted to add that into the conversation.
That adds great context, and that's definitely a valid point. and it's one that I hope, really resonates with our listeners. And one of the things that I try to, think about when I think about these things is I try to put myself in the position of European Americans because, I can understand, I can empathize with how some of them may feel attacked. Because now all of a sudden in the media, social and news media, you're starting to hear terms like white privilege, systemic racism, and things like that attack everything that their lives have been built on, and in a sense, everything they believed in terms of what their lives have been built on, in terms of my grandfather and my father and my mother, and they worked hard to get to where they are, and now you're telling me they were given a handout. It was on the backs of other people, and because of some privilege, I'm out here working hard, and life is hard for me too. So I can understand how some of them reject that notion. I can understand. Oh, let me say this: I can understand why their knee-jerk reaction would be to reject those notions and those concepts. But what I try to impress upon and encourage those people who have that knee-jerk reaction to do is just dig a little deeper and evaluate it and stick in there a little bit longer and see what's at the core of this, especially because there's a lot of European American people sending this message and trying to communicate with you about what these things are, from European Americans to European Americans, not to mention all the amazing African American scholars and sociologists and activists who've been sharing these same and articulating these same messages. So it's not an attack on you, and we're not saying that you should feel guilty or that you had anything to do with those things. What is going to lead to a question for you, but what I'm ultimately, I think I'm asking, because I always wonder, like, what are we really asking of non-African Americans, and especially what are we asking of European Americans who weren't, didn't have anything to do with the things that we talk about from the past? What are we asking? And for me, when I think about that, I think that we're just simply asking for compassion. We're asking for empathy. I feel like that's it. And I think that's what people are having a hard time grasping. We're not asking you to feel guilty or feel like you did something or apologize for something you didn't do. We're just asking you to stop trying to rationalize away the trauma that Africans experience, as those of us who are descendants of slaves. Try to understand it. Ask questions. And that's what bothers me. My thing and my point is, if you don't understand something, I'd rather you say nothing than to try to rationalize it away or explain away my pain that you just don't understand. It has nothing to do with the American dream or the fact that I have an education and I have a job and I have a house and I have a family. That stuff means nothing. It's my soul. It's my psychology. I want to feel whole there as well. So, and socially, we want to feel, or I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think I can say this for a lot of African people. We want to feel that ownership, that we do belong here, and that's what we're fighting for. So what would you say, Speech, in terms of, what the expectation is and what are we trying to get to? What do we want European Americans to understand when we have these discussions?
Sure. Brother, everything you just said, I would agree with. And the only thing I'd add is justice. We're asking them to help us with justice. And we would do the same for them, and we should do the same for them and anyone else. See, what's been robbed of African people in this country, among all the things we talked about emotionally, spiritually, is justice. And so what they also can do, along with having compassion, which compassion is really the catalyst to ignite justice, fight with us. Fight with us to help the justice system become truly that. Fight with us to help the prison system to become just. Fight with us so that the laws are just. Fight with us so that as we're striving to create equality in a country that has been based on inequality, fight with us and don't fight against us. Fight with us. Help to spread and disseminate the correct information about this country's history without skewing it. Don't skew it towards black. Don't skew it towards white. Just tell the truth. Let's be about justice. And we'll do the same for you, and we want to do the same for you. And, someone said this a long time ago, and I'm going to paraphrase, is that people don't want to get involved with an issue until it hits them. And so what we're asking is that, listen, if we don't get justice, this is what Martin Luther King said, if we don't get justice, there'll be a point when you don't get justice. We're really just fighting for this incredible concept called justice. And that's what we need this country to become, is just. All the way within its systematic problem, because the systematic racism is what keeps us down more than people's attitudes. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that this country has been built upon injustice, it needs to be corrected, and justice needs to be the law of the land. And when that happens, then we all can heal a lot quicker, and we all can get to what I think most people want to get to, which is a sense of harmony and a sense of brotherhood and humanity. And we want to get to that. The sins of the past, unfortunately, hold consequences for the future. That's the truth about any mistakes or sin or however you want to call it. And so we have got to get to a place where we are willing to deal with the sins of the past in order to bring about true healing and not just a Band-Aid over a huge gash.
Powerfully and wonderfully said. It's funny, I always say that we all want the same things, and you just summed that up, beautifully. And, that's a perfect place to stop. And, that's usually I like to end out with a solution segment. And that's what you and I just did, actually. We just spoke to solutions, and I just didn't give it the proper segue. But that was actually our solution segment. And I appreciate you, giving this time, setting this time aside to have this dialogue with me. And, I hope it was rewarding for you to be able to share these things with the listeners, and I'm sure that our listeners will get a lot out of this. So what I like to do is, to close things out, just to ask you to tell our listeners, how they can connect with you and your work.
Definitely. First of all, thank you so much, Scott, for having me on here. It was awesome. The discussion was fantastic. And I want to thank all the listeners for even listening. So if you've gotten this far, that means you were somehow or another engaged, or you just took the torture of listening. And I thank you, because these types of conversations are so important. They're the type of conversations that need to be had, and not just the conversation, but the action that goes with it. And so I appreciate everybody listening. And the way that you can reach me is, I think the quickest way is AD the Band. My band is called Arrested Development, as Scott said earlier. AD stands for that, so adtheband.com. And we have our music, which Trauma is one of the songs that we talked about today. And we have, I've done a TED Talks just recently. That's up there. We on our news section of our website. We have, everything from swag, T-shirts, everything. So please come to our website, AD the Band. We got 2 new albums that are featured on this website right now. We'd love for you to pick up the music. We love your support. We want your support. And, spread the word. So adtheband.com is how you can reach me.
Awesome. Well, that's our time for today. Again, thank you so much, Speech. It's been an honor. I know you're getting a lot of requests around this new album, and you're doing a lot of different media. So I appreciate you carving out some time to come on to Race Haven. And for our listeners, be sure to subscribe to the Race Haven Radio Show and Podcast on iTunes or Stitcher Radio so that you never miss the dialogue. If you love this show, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher podcast apps. This will help the show gain more visibility and listeners. And we want to hear from you. So please visit racehavenblog.com and leave comments and questions about today's show. If you have questions there that you leave there for Speech, I'll let him know, and he'll stop by and dialogue. And I'll do the same at racehavenblog.com. Also visit adtheband.com and engage in all of the wonderful content that Speech and Arrested Development has there as well. And with Race Haven, you can join our online community by joining the Race Haven Facebook group. If today's episode resonated with you, please share the podcast link on social media and with your friends. Race Haven is a safe place for people from diverse ethnic, religious, cultural, and political backgrounds to bring their race-based perspectives, questions, assumptions, frustrations, and experiences to engage in thoughtful, honest dialogue in an effort to transcend race in America. Remember, we are all smarter when we think together. Peace.
This episode of Race Haven was sponsored by the 5 for Friends app. 5 for Friends is available for download on iPhone and Android devices now. Have you ever played phone tag with a friend for weeks because you both were so busy? Do you put off calling family and friends for fear of being tied up on the phone for too long? If yes, then 5 for Friends is the solution. It's a mobile app that makes it easy and convenient to verbally keep in touch with family and friends, 5 minutes at a time. Visit 5forfriends.com or your app store to download. It's the number 5, FOR, Friends. Try it today.
Thanks for listening to the Race Haven Radio Show and Podcast. Be sure to visit www.racehavenblog.com to comment and learn more.
When we go out to eat, we never agree on where to go.
I want burgers. Pizza.
Tacos it is.
The one thing we do agree on is we all want unlimited high-speed data. That's why we switched to Metro PCS.
Stop by Metro PCS with the whole family and get 4 lines with unlimited LTE data for just $100, period. Metro PCS. Wireless. Figured out.
Coverage not available in some areas. Offers require port and of number not currently active on T-Mobile network. During congestion, the fraction of customers using more than 35 gigs per month may notice reduced speeds. Video streams at up to 40p. No tethering. See store for details and terms and conditions.